Hello there, I'm Laura Lee. Thanks for tuning in to Conversation for Exploration. We've often commented on the show that we are hardwired for spiritual experiences, and Dr. Andrew Newberg joins us tonight to tell us just why. In his experiments with Buddhist and Franciscan nuns and others, he's found some solid evidence that mystical experiences are not just wishful thinking, are not just mood-making, but they do produce observable neurological events. And so the question is, why is this? Why would we have brains that are so tuned to God, tuned to spiritual experiences, that we are indeed hardwired for this? Some intriguing questions, some intriguing research, and Andy has written Why God Won't Go Away, Brain Science and the Biology of Belief. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
How did you, give us a bit about your background, and how did you first shape this question and then begin to set out to find the evidence that we are indeed hardwired for spiritual experiences?
Right. Well, I've actually been interested in some of these sort of big questions that have plagued humankind since the beginning of time, really, questions about how we understand reality and what we can know about our spirituality and about God or religion, and just about why we're here in the first place.
Those eternal age-old
questions. And I think to a certain extent we all face those questions at one point or another in our lives. And as I grew older, I began to realize that one of the most important things that we were going to have to know about was the human mind, because that's the part of us that allows us to ask those kinds of questions and to ponder the answers and to try to ultimately find some answers for us. So I realized that I was somehow going to have to look at what was going on in the brain and try to understand how that related to the answers to those kinds of questions. When I entered into the medical profession, there were a number of different tools and information and different types of techniques that allowed us to have a much closer examination of how the brain actually works and what the kind of things it does for us just in our everyday life. And ultimately, we'd be able to find ways in which we could understand what happens when we have these very profound types of experiences that people may have during meditation or prayer, or sometimes even spontaneously. We had actually tried to create an overall model about what is going on in the brain when people have different types of spiritual experiences. And we tried to, it was sort of like a big puzzle, and we were tying together different pieces from what we knew about how the brain worked. So, for example, we know that the part of the brain towards the, right behind the forehead, the frontal part of the brain, is very involved in our ability to focus our attention. If we're trying to drive a car or solve a mathematical problem, we use that frontal lobe to help us focus our attention. It turns out that when people are doing meditation or prayer, that they're also, in some senses, focusing their attention on a particular spiritual practice. So we had talked about the fact that the frontal lobe may be very involved in these kinds of practices. We then looked at some other parts of the brain also, such as an area towards the back top part of the brain. It's in the area called the parietal lobe, and we sometimes refer to it as the orientation area, because what it does is it takes all of our sensory input and helps to construct for us a sense of the self and tries to help us orient that self. One of the most powerful sort of universal characteristics of spiritual experiences is a sense of oneness or a sense of unity with certain things, and that could be fundamental reality or God, or depending on however the person defines that. So we had talked also about the fact that that particular area would also be involved in these kinds of experiences. And then we looked at parts of the brain that were involved in emotional responses and how the brain ultimately is tied into the human body to understand all the different types of physiological processes and psychological processes that go on when people have spiritual experiences. So that was one way that we sort of created this overall model, and then ultimately realized that with some of the brain imaging work that we had, that we would be able to actually test our hypothesis and actually see if we could get a better handle on what exactly was going on in the brain during these experiences, and try to sort of refine our models and try to learn more about what goes on in the brain during these really phenomenal experiences that people have.
When people have spontaneous experiences, you can't predict when they're going to happen, so of course you would turn to subjects that would be skilled at inculcating some of those experiences on schedule.
Right, that's correct.
Thus, you went to...
Right, so we decided that we needed to actually, if we were going to study this type of experience that people were having, we would need to find some way of doing it in a kind of laboratory setting, and obviously you could think about ways of trying to determine what people are doing when they have spontaneous experiences, but then you pretty much have people walking around with electrodes on their brain waiting for somebody to have that particular mystical experience that obviously be very hard and very kind of strange study. Right.
In a laboratory.
Better to get somebody who knows how to do it and can do it in a repeated fashion and in a similar fashion to other people. And that was also very important for us to have people who could all do basically the same kind of practice to create a same kind of experience within themselves. And
control measures so that you don't say, well, this person's just geared and they're a fluke, and
that's
off
correct.
the charts.
That's
you want
correct.
to see, is it reproducible among a general population?
Right.
Yeah.
So what we actually were able to do was to try to bring these meditators into our laboratory and have them do a particular form of meditation. They were all Tibetan Buddhist meditators, and they could all come in. They all were very experienced. They had 15 to 20 years of meditation experience. And
did they come to Tibet? Were they from
No, actually,
schools?
most of these people were Americans who were practicing Tibetan Buddhist meditation as their sort of spiritual practice. And but it actually presents some very interesting questions about the research itself, because we had a lot of decision making to do as far as who we actually did have for our subjects. We decided to take people who had 15 to 20 years of experience, like I mentioned, because we wanted people who we felt pretty comfortable would be able to accomplish the meditation practice and to do it even though they had an intravenous line attached in their arm and doing it within these cameras and things like that. So we wanted somebody who could have a pretty good experience. It'd be very interesting to see how people who have only been doing this kind of practice for a short period of time, maybe several years, would respond and would be different. But we were concerned that those people may not be able to actually achieve the kind of experiences that they are used to having in their practice. There's actually even a theoretical problem with taking people, as you mentioned, from, let's say, Tibet or something like that, where if we were to take people who are masters of their particular tradition, the theoretical state of those people is that they are always in that mystical experience, that they are always in that universal state of awareness. And in that case, perhaps we wouldn't see any change. So there was a lot of interesting questions that were raised by pursuing this particular question, and we decided that the best people would be to have people who had a fairly significant amount of experience, but who were perhaps not necessarily the best. But ultimately, in the future, we hope to be able to study different types of people in terms of their experience.
Yogis and...
Yes, exactly.
And you've got a whole range of spiritual practices.
Right. I mean, exactly.
And I'm sure each one of them has a different profile neurologically that it produces.
Correct. And I think that one of the areas to go is that, as you mentioned, there are thousands of different approaches to meditation, both within particular traditions. So Tibetan Buddhism has many different approaches to meditation. We were looking at just one, whereas we could then ultimately compare it to different traditions and different practices. And you had also mentioned that we have done some initial work with some Franciscan nuns. So we have some ability to have a basis of comparison.
Can you see in the future, at some point, a lot of data accumulated in this way so that when a new spiritual seeker arrives, somebody reaches the age of whatever, and they go, okay, I want to seek a spiritual practice. They could be tested somehow, and somebody could say, you might do very well with yoga over here, or this kind of meditation. Because I've heard of other people who've pursued a particular form of meditation and didn't get results for years, and then they switched to something else and they got immediate results, and they're going, well, was it just because I finally popped, or did this just work better for my particular, brain, mind, body, whatever, destiny? And so you can see some very interesting results project into the future with these kinds of studies. Who funded the study?
Well, actually, the initial work was funded by a group called the Templeton Foundation, who's very interested in the field of science and religion. And but you raised some interesting questions, though, about how people sort of feel about these experiences and how they get themselves into these experiences and how they ultimately have an impact on their lives. It seems that questions about how we can actually understand these types of experiences from the perspective of the person themselves and also from a biological perspective may help us to understand. And what are the benefits? But the idea that there are, everybody is an individual, and there are many different types of practices out there, and perhaps they're out there because they affect people differently. As you were mentioning, there is some people are very affected by meditation, and some people have come up to me after I give a talk and they say, you know what, I tried meditation a couple times and I just don't get it. I mean, it just doesn't do anything for me. So we're all built a little differently, and to a certain extent our research actually does talk about that, because the goal of our research really is to sort of develop a framework upon which we can then think about all these other types of spiritual experiences and practices. So we can look at the basic structures of the brain, their basic functions, and understand how they all interact when people have these experiences, realizing that depending on the particular approach and depending on the individual person and all the things that they bring to it, what they may ultimately be able to experience because of that particular practice. So for some people, being able to sit quietly in a room and meditate may create a very powerful kind of experience for them. For somebody else, maybe they need physical activity. Maybe they need a form of yoga or even some kind of drumming or rhythmic type of music.
Maybe doing art to get into the flow state that
absolutely.
Mihai talks about, or whatever.
That's exactly right. So we're all sort of different.
What is an advantage of living in today's culture when all of these various things are accessible to us, as opposed to growing up in one culture where that was the only thing available to you?
Right.
But
that is correct. And actually, I was just going to mention that there's an interesting study that I came across at one point that looked at drumming rituals, and it was very interesting to note that the most effective drumming rituals were usually the ones that varied the rate of the drumming over the course of the ritual. The idea that the investigators came up with was that by not just having slow rhythms or not by just having fast rhythms, but by having both slow and fast, you could actually incorporate more of the people who were partaking in the ritual. If you just did the slow, then you'd lose the people who respond to the fast, and if you just did the fast, you'd lose the people that respond to the slow.
Interesting. How did you test these people? You mentioned an IV in the arm, and of course those electrodes are easy to kind of paste on.
Right.
So how did you set it up? You were testing various parts of the brain, but I'm sure you're also looking at pulse and heart rate and response and on and on. What were the physiological parameters you were looking at?
Our first foray into this was to actually keep things pretty simple, but what we were using was a pretty complicated type of technique that we could actually image the person's brain, and we were actually measuring blood flow in the brain. It's interesting that
because
blood
if that
flow,
part is activating, then the blood flow will
gets more blood flow, right? And areas that are turned off will get less blood flow. And what we can do is basically achieve a snapshot, so to speak, of what's going on in the brain at any particular moment. I could inject somebody while they're playing tennis, or I could if I could catch them, I could inject somebody while they're reading or while they're solving a problem, and then we can image them sometime later that tells us exactly what they're doing at the time of the injection. So that's basically
so you get a profile of this activity produces these results.
Time.
Did you look at brainwave activity as well?
No, we didn't actually do that at this point, and that's been something that I think will be a very interesting thing to add on to the research, because I don't think anybody's really sort of put all of the different components together yet. That's going to be our future goal, which is to try to integrate all the different physiological measures that you were measuring in terms of blood pressure and heart rate, in addition to the electrical changes that are going on in the brain, with what we see actually happening in the brain. But the techniques that we were using actually have an ability to see some pretty small structures in the brain and to be able to see exactly what they're doing during the time of meditation.
Before we get to that, how do you get the brain imaging? How does that work? How do you collect that data from the person?
Right. Actually, what happens is that, as I mentioned before, we actually start at the very beginning of the study by putting in a very small IV line, an intravenous line. What we can do then is we inject actually a radioactive material that follows the blood flow.
These are brave volunteers.
So these are somewhat brave. It's not very much radioactivity, fortunately.
The mere thought of it.
But they basically will have this injection of the tracer as it goes into the brain. It gets locked in, and then since it's radioactive, it emits certain photons, that can be picked up by a camera, and then we're able to sort of reconstruct these images and create a three-dimensional view of what the brain is and where it's functioning. So it actually is a really very powerful technique. There's a number of different of these types of what are called functional imaging techniques, because they actually are able to measure the function of different parts of the brain during different types of tasks. It's really been these types of techniques which have revolutionized our understanding of the brain over the last decade. So it certainly makes a lot of sense that we would then apply them to more and more complex types of thinking and brain processing and brain function, such as what occurred during different types of spiritual practices like meditation.
How does mere blood flow tell you? I mean, okay, that little area is being activated, but what does that really tell you, and what conclusions can you draw from that? And you said even minute changes were significant to you.
Well,
How
again,
does that create a picture?
Sure. Well, what we do, ultimately we have a picture on our computer screen that has different colors to it that tell us whether certain parts of the brain are more or less active, and then we can actually do a very sort of number crunching analysis where we can actually tell you that a certain part of the brain was activated or inactivated by 10% or 15%, and then compare that among the different people who we had brought into our lab to get an average, and to see where the quote-unquote statistically significant changes are, which is what the scientists are always trying to achieve.
So the same part of the brain lights up in all of the subjects when they're all doing the same form of meditation.
Then that suggests that, right, and that's what we were striving for. So for example, going back to what we were talking about with our model a little bit, what we did find, for example, in our 8 Tibetan Buddhists was that they tended all to activate that frontal part of the brain during their meditation. The other thing that was very interesting is that they tended to have a decrease in activity in that orientation area that I mentioned. And that goes very much in line with what we had predicted would happen, because we thought that by blocking the sensory input into that area, because the brain can actually regulate the types of nerve impulses and so forth that go back and forth between different parts of the brain. But we thought that if a person can actually block the input into that area, then even though it continues to try to generate a sense of the self and generate an orientation of that self, it has less and less information to do that. The ultimate result would be that you'd actually have sort of a loss of that boundary between the self and the world, and you'd feel a blending of the self into the world, or becoming one with the object of meditation or God, or depending on whatever the person is defining that as. And also a very commonly used description of mystical experiences is that people sometimes feel that as if space sort of dissolves. They feel like they've gotten to a point of infinite space or even spacelessness. And that also may go in line with the fact that they may be blocking the activity getting into that area. Now, we did see some changes in some other areas. One of them was actually called the thalamus, and that's an area that's very important for overall brain function. It actually helps to connect a number of different parts of the brain so that it can help regulate the flow. And basically the meaning of that, we think, is that the brain is actually very active during meditation. A lot of times people think meditation is just sort of letting the mind kind of go to sleep, but it's significantly different than sleep, and it's a state of the mind in which there's a lot of activity going on, and it can create these very, very strong, very powerful kinds of experiences for these people. So those are some of the changes that we saw. And actually one of the other things that was very interesting is that while we saw increased activity in that frontal part of the brain, the more that activity was, the more they had an increase in that activity, the more they actually had a decrease in the orientation area. So that also supported the model that we were working on, which was that the more the person is attending to their particular meditation practice, the more they're able to achieve this kind of a state of absorption into the object. So that all goes pretty much in line with what we had hypothesized. We ultimately have to do a lot more studies to really know exactly what's going on, especially as we were talking earlier about all the different types of experiences that people may have and how they may understand them.
Would you suppose, is this one of your hypotheses, that the type of practice that a certain group of people do produces certain inner experiences, and perhaps that conclusions are made about the state of the universe based on their inner experience, but how do we know how accurate that experience, that cosmological view that is the output of that experience is? If you do some other meditation, it might give you a slightly different experience. It might influence a different cosmological. How much of it is dependent on our inner experience? Well, and how much do we have a tap on objective reality out there, or is there such a thing?
Right. Well, that's actually one of the most important points that we make in our research and in our work. That, and to me, it's actually sort of one of the most fascinating issues of all, which is how we understand reality and how we can get at what is really real.
Can we get out of our own way to do it?
Exactly.
Do we have access points inside to get to somewhere real?
That's exactly correct. And I think in that particular circumstance, when we look at what our brain science can do, we have certain limitations to it. We can talk about what happens in the brain when people have these kinds of experiences. But what our research actually has shown is
Thank you. A scientist that realized that science cannot ever have all of the answers, and there are inherent limitations. So few of them do, I have to say, but go ahead.
So, well, thank you. I appreciate that. But that is actually a very important thing that distinguishes a lot of our work from other people in this area who are looking at these types of questions. But we realize that what we're able to show is the effect in the brain that people have when they have these kinds of experiences. So if somebody has a mystical experience, we can say, okay, that has certain types of brain changes that are associated with it. Somebody's walking down the street, that has certain types of brain changes associated with it. What we can say from that kind of analysis is that all of them are associated with what's going on in the brain. But the problem is that that still doesn't tell you what is really out there. So, for example, if we take an image of somebody's brain while they're looking at a piece of apple pie, which is my usual example because I'm partial to desserts, is that we can tell exactly what the person is experiencing when they have that vision or when they're looking at that piece of pie.
Because you know in the outer, you can share exactly what they're looking at,
well,
as opposed to looking inside their brain.
Well, if we do the imaging study, all we can do is tell you what's going on in the brain during the experience, but we can't tell you whether or not the apple pie is truly out there. And that goes as well with any kind of experience that we have, so that when you look at spiritual experiences or other types of experiences that we have, you ultimately have to leave the science behind a little bit. Science sort of levels the playing field for us to realize that they're all real, at least from the perspective of biology. Mm-hmm. But in terms of what is the most correct in terms of some kind of external objective reality, what we have to realize is that we have to look at the experiences in and of themselves. The interesting thing with that is that while our usual everyday reality feels very real to us, it's interesting that most of these mystical types of experiences or very powerful spiritual experiences are usually perceived of as being more real than our everyday reality.
And how do we know we're not just all living in some sort of matrix a la the movie?
Well, right. I mean, and it's interesting when you look at different types of our experiences of reality. When we have a dream, for example, it may feel very real when we have it, but when we come back into our baseline reality, we say, oh, that was just a dream. Even though it was scary or something like that, I know that it was just a dream. It didn't have the full characteristics, the vividness of our usual everyday reality. But when people have spiritual experiences and then they come back into our everyday reality, they still think that those experiences represented a closer fundamental reality than what we are in on our everyday level. So it creates for us a bit of a paradox with it, which is trying to understand which of these realities is really real. I think our ultimate conclusion that we come to is that science and what we usually consider as spiritual have to be integrated in a way in which we can kind of use both of them to enhance each other rather than knock each other down. I think that there's a very powerful way that we can ultimately bring them together, and I think our research is sort of a first step along those lines, which is to try and find out how science and religion or spirituality can ultimately come together to overall give us a much better understanding of who we are as human beings and how we come to understand the world.
When the near-death experience and some of those first studies came on the scene some years ago, I was really annoyed by the scientists who said, okay, fine, so these people come back and they're having these really real, profound experiences that are earth-shaking to them, that are bedrock to them, that are just so real to them, and discount that and say, oh, but we have found that a certain part of the brain is activated during the near-death experience, so it all has to be just a mere function of the brain doing something unusual, and that's what's caused. Right. There is no God, there is no tunnel, there is no this, there is no that. It's just merely a hiccup of the brain. Right. I'm so annoyed by that. That is not the only conclusion to draw from the fact that a certain part of the brain is stimulated during these experiences.
Right. There's a lot of different examples of that kind of thing that you mentioned. I think another very common one when we look at religious experience in general are people who have found that patients with temporal lobe seizures or temporal lobe epilepsy, temporal lobe is an area towards the side of the brain, that they have hyperreligiosity, or they may have experiences that are very similar to spiritual practices. So they say, well, then everything's just activated in the temporal lobe. That's all that these experiences are.
Spirituality is a disease, they
or
might conclude
or
as well.
pathology, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, there was a group of people who actually had a very interesting paper that I always enjoy talking about, which is where they had this table of the great mystics of history and tried to give each of them their own diagnosis with complex partial seizures and mania and schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Right. So exact St. John had this, and of course, I think that it does. All of those things do provide us about how our brain experiences these things.
But we can't jump to conclusions.
But we have to be very careful not to jump to the conclusion, the really not correct conclusion about the fact that all of these experiences, therefore, must be these kinds of problems. Certainly people who have these problems will have these kinds of experiences, but it's really almost impossible and not really totally logical to then jump to the conclusion where we say that everybody who has experiences like this is having some kind of problem in their brain. So, and that to a certain extent is what I think our research also helps to support, that these are not people who have seizure disorders or other types of problems going on in their brain, but these are people who have very normal types of function that are, working in a, not in a normal way, but working in a way which is basically normal function, just in slightly unusual circumstances.
Or an expanded
functioning. Exactly.
It would be very interesting to study with brain imaging, some of the same techniques, some experiences of schizophrenics during some of their episodes or epilepsy or whatever, just to see that there is a profile there.
Right.
And I bet it's different in many regards to the profile of these Tibetan and Franciscan nuns undergoing their mystical experiences.
Right.
So it really can't compare apples and oranges here.
It's difficult, but it also raises some very interesting questions that myself and some other
and we will get to those questions with
about.
Dr. Andrew Newberg. His book is Why God Won't Go Away, Brain Science and the Biology of Belief. The Radio Bookstore has this at 800-243-1438. We come back with Andrew Newberg just after this. I'm Laura Lee.
Laura Lee Online, www.lauralee.com.
All interviews on The Laura Lee Show are available on audio cassette. For information, call 1-800-243-1438. The sweet secret of the herb stevia lies in a complex molecule called stevioside, a glycoside composed of glucose, sophrose, and steviol, a complex molecule that gives this herb from Paraguay its extraordinary sweetness, 10 to 15 times sweeter than common table sugar. But here's the really extraordinary part. Stevia does not affect blood sugar metabolism. Some studies even report that stevia reduces plasma glucose levels in normal adults. Sweet, nutritious, natural, and good for you. Wisdom of the Ancients introduces Stevia Plus. Take these little packets with you everywhere, containing powdered stevia that equals 2 teaspoons of sugar in sweetness. Sprinkle on food and beverages alike. I use stevia daily. Add the liquid concentrate to lemon juice and water, and you have refreshing lemonade, and decarbonated water for a soda substitute. Stevia makes any herbal tea taste sweeter and better. Stevia is good for your skin, too, applied externally. Try it. It's versatile, good for you, and sweet without the calories.
Wisdom of the Ancient Stevia products are the highest quality available. Call 1-800-243-1438.
We all try to watch our diet to get a balance of nutrition, but that's not always possible. There is a gap between the nutrition from the average American diet and the optimum diet for the human system. The challenge is to take care of our own health while being able to enjoy comfort foods. That's why nutritionist and biochemist Udo Erasmus developed Missing Link. It bridges this gap with foods naturally high in essential nutrients, trace minerals, vitamins, and fiber. Call 1-800-243-1438. Missing Link is a powder that you sprinkle on your food, making your food taste better, and 3 tablespoons daily is all you need to achieve optimum nutrition. Call 1-800-243-1438. Each bag contains a 1-month supply and is only $19.95. Call 1-800-243-1438.
Oh, that's Lolly, here on the Lolly Show, our guest, Dr. Andrew Newberg. His book, Why God Won't Go Away, Brain Science and the Biology of Belief. The question is, are we hardwired for mystical experiences, for belief in God, to create religions? And the answer is, yeah, the observable scientific research so far suggests indeed we are. Then the question, as always, well, why are we designed that way?
Right.
Is this an accident? Who designed us? Do other animals? Does my dog lying here in the studio, does he also have mystical experiences? Is it just the function of a brain? The shamans believe that everything is animate. Everything is tuned in to this conscious universe.
Correct.
So would that mean across the board everything is also hardwired for this, receiving, giving information? Can get really interesting.
Oh, there's some great questions. There's two basic approaches to how somebody might actually look at our particular research in terms of studying brain function, and that comes from either being a very religious or someone who believes in the existence of God versus people who may not believe in the existence of God.
Oh, check out the brains of atheists.
Right.
Let's see why.
Well, we could do something like that, sure.
Yeah.
But one of the things that's interesting is that we've actually based a lot of our research on a fairly biological approach. We started with a very reductionistic approach and actually looked at things from an evolutionary perspective and said, well, how is it that religion may ultimately have benefits for us as human beings, and why would it ultimately become sort of genetically wired, so to speak, into the brains of human beings?
So that those humans that were religious had better survival odds than those who
People
weren't.
who may not have been predisposed to that.
Therefore,
Correct.
it's an evolutionary imperative.
Well, that's one argument to make,
Mm-hmm.
and we actually make that argument along two lines. One is that we talk about religion as having a self-maintenance role. When we look at what the brain is trying to accomplish for us as a general rule, it's helping us to survive and get through our everyday lives, and helping us to solve problems, helping us to find mates, to interact with people within our communities or our societies, and also to regulate our body's functions and our mental health and everything so that we survive on to the next day.
Sure, religion does all that. You're right.
And religion certainly does accomplish all that in a very powerful way. So from that perspective, it does make sense that the mind would certainly like having a concept of religion around, because it helps it to accomplish that goal. The other very important function of the brain is something that we've referred to as self-transcendence. And transcendence has frequently come to mean this sort of more mystical aspect of transcendence, but we actually look at it on a very basic approach, which is that every day, every moment of our lives, we are, in some senses, transcending ourselves. We're still the same person that we were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, but we're obviously a lot different. We had different experiences. We've gone through different things and different changes. And, of course, we can't continue to act like a child, for example, when we're 40 years old, because we obviously wouldn't function very well in society. So the brain has the ability to transcend itself from day to day and from moment to moment and life stage to life stage, so that we always are adding new things and adding new behaviors and developing differently so that we can continue to function. It ultimately ties back into the survival aspect. But of course, religion has a very powerful self-transcendent approach and a very powerful self-transcendent function for us, because one, we certainly see religion and spirituality coming into play during a lot of transcendent changes in our lives, going from one life stage to the next. And we see that, for example, in Judaism, where you go through the bar mitzvah and the marriage and so forth as you go from one stage of life to the next. But also, religion offers for us, in many ways, the ultimate transcendent experience, which would be to
mitigate death.
To either transcend death or to become something greater than what we actually are, and in some senses become something more spiritual, or at least, however one defines it, getting more in touch with ultimate reality than we actually usually do. So on those two levels, from an evolutionary perspective, we can see why people who did have certain inclinations towards spirituality and religion would do so well. That helps to make their societies more cohesive. It gives them more meaning and purpose in life. And all of these things allow them to do better and to survive better, which is theoretically the goal of evolutionary pressures, which is to help us survive. Now, again, that's a very reductionistic approach. And then we can ultimately see that a lot of the structures that we're talking about, the frontal lobe and the orientation area, do exist to a certain extent in other animals. And we actually built a lot of our research on the study of different types of rituals and ritual behaviors in animals, and to look at how rituals actually help animals to unify with each other or create, their own sort of groups, and whether that's just a mating group or whether it's a larger extended group of the animal, that's one of our ways of looking at what goes on in the brain during those experiences.
Rituals, an example would be?
Well, like mating rituals are probably the most common, but a lot of animals go through a great deal of rhythmicity and different types of gestures and changes to, one, identify the fact that this is an animal that is okay to go and mate with.
Ritual is part of instinct.
Well, to a certain extent, but I don't know if it would necessarily be defined completely as instinct. See, when we talk about actual like mating behaviors, for example, one of the things that's very interesting is that, I mean, animals in general don't necessarily come together that much, especially the ones that are more competitive. They frequently will keep themselves pretty well separated.
But they have to in order to procreate.
Exactly. So rituals allow them to break down that sort of self-other barrier.
And to communicate very clearly
and to
what's
communicate exactly what's going to happen, exactly. So, and we, of course, have a great deal of rituals, both in religious practices and just in our everyday lives. We experience rhythms and different types of rituals all the time that help us to do those, to accomplish those kinds of problems that we need to solve. So, this is all from a very reductionistic perspective, but we can see that there may be explanations to this from a perspective of evolution, from a perspective of biology. Now, if you go to the other perspective, which is a more spiritual or more religiously inclined person, they would look at the whole scenario and say, well, of course it makes sense that the brain is designed to have spiritual experiences, because if God is there and if God is going to have some kind of connection to us, well, it would be silly not to have a brain. Yeah, I mean, it would be really silly to have a brain that actually had no specific way of understanding God or being able to actually incorporate the teachings and so forth into our everyday lives. So absolutely it makes sense. And I've had people really from all ends of the spectrum who have been very interested in this work, because for people who are religious, I think we have a great deal of reverence for that kind of approach and that perspective on things. And we actually find ways of supporting it to tell them, no, you're not crazy. This is a real important thing for you, and it has great meaning, and it affects you in physical ways and psychological, and you derive benefits from it, and of course it has a great deal of meaning from a spiritual perspective. But if somebody wants to be very biological about it, we can also look at how these experiences ultimately affect people, how they affect them in terms of their health, physical health and mental health, and look at it all from a very sort of basic biological mechanism as well.
So you're saying, here's the data, here's what we found, and for
yourself.
You will. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because there are no conclusions to come to yet. We're just in our infancy in looking at this whole issue, because we've got these now new toys at our disposal, and we're just now beginning to use them to map out this.
Right. I mean, there are certain conclusions that we can come to, and again, I think we can certainly say that the brain functions in such a way that religion is such a very powerful part of it, that's why religion really doesn't go away. But that doesn't mean that that what is actually out there in terms of answering that ultimate question of whether or not there is a God or something like that, that's something that the neuroscience at least can answer, and we can just talk about what we can see and what we can observe, and we can see its effect on us as human beings.
It is interesting to look back at the earliest known artifacts of mankind, and you see various grave burials where flowers and red ochre was painted on the skin, and they're put in a fetal position, and grave goods are buried with them in preparation for the afterlife. And there are indications that humankind has been religiously oriented, spiritually oriented from the get-go.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, that just sort of lends itself to the idea that we really are, in many ways, built to have these kinds of experiences.
And thank heavens, wouldn't life be boring without them?
Well, that's true. I mean, I think, our ability to have this higher level thinking, our ability to ponder these big questions that we talked about at the beginning, it's really a blessing and a curse. I mean, on one hand, it's great to have a brain that can perceive these questions.
It's a lot of baggage stuff to deal with.
But yeah, we have to find ways. It can create a great deal of anxiety for us to understand these questions, and of course the big question also about our own death and how we deal with that. So having our ability to perceive some additional aspect of reality that we may not see in a very physical sense has a very powerful ability for us to help calm our anxieties, to help us feel better about our place in the world. And it's through rituals and the development of myths and different stories we have about our world that we come to understand these answers to these questions. It makes us feel better and allows us to kind of go out there and do the things that we actually do need to do in order to survive.
What are your thoughts on the fact that our brain is hardwired to have these experiences, and we are the creatures that have developed language skills and mold our civilization and go into various societies and experiments and on the ways to conduct ourselves and this, that, and the other, that we're a work in progress. But we have the skills, the brain capacity to do this, to reinvent ourselves.
Right.
Would you say that that's part and parcel of this other inbuilt tuning to God and religion?
Right.
That this is all there to support it, so we can tell ourselves the story, so that we can pass down and create writing and storytelling to pass down this information to the next generation, that we can, make it so interesting here.
Right. Well, that's exactly right. I mean, I think
we
that
have the one without the other, I guess.
Exactly. It's very difficult to imagine ourselves having an ability to understand religion and God without necessarily having the ability to talk about it or to express it. But it raises some very interesting questions and some potentially very interesting studies that could be done, because one could conceive of a brain, for example, that may not have the usual abilities that we talk about. And one of the things that we frequently talk about in our work, for example, is the ability of our brain to perceive cause and effect. Now, we sort of take that for granted. We actually did a study back in Philadelphia.
The basics of science, cause and effect.
Exactly, and it does support science. We actually did a little sort of side experiment back in Philadelphia when we had an earthquake. I know there was a big one here recently. And we were just sort of asking people what their thoughts were. And everybody pretty much universally said, well, I first thought it was going to be, it was a large truck going by, or I thought it was a train, or I thought it was an earthquake. The bottom line is that people didn't say to themselves, I better figure out what it is that's making that rumbling noise. The brain automatically works. It automatically sets us off to start understanding and to look at what is the cause of this sensation that I'm feeling, and it perceives that cause very quickly, and it starts hypothesizing causes, even if it doesn't have one.
Skill.
It's a survival skill. But one could, and when we look at religion and how we understand specifically the concept of God,
we like unfinished answers.
We don't like
questions.
Exactly. We have these unfinished questions, unfinished causal questions about what caused the universe, and God typically is given in a religious sense as the fundamental cause of all things. So one can really sort of do a little experiment, or a theoretical experiment of, well, what would our conception of God be like if we didn't have the ability to perceive cause and effect? Like I said, we take that ability for granted. There are some unusual circumstances where people get brain damage in particular areas and they can't do that. I haven't actually seen any sort of investigation as to how they feel about God.
We should seek them out and interview them.
We should, absolutely. Yeah. And that would be very interesting to see if their perception of what is typically considered spiritual, or what we consider God as a primary cause of things, whether or not they would still have that feeling, or whether their perception of God may be just very different. Maybe it would just be that there's some sort of universal connection, but there isn't necessarily a cause and effect or a creative element there that we typically ascribe to God from a religious perspective. So it raises some very interesting questions about how we, not just the idea of having God or religion, but how that idea is ultimately incorporated into our lives and how it has meaning for us, because it's only through our brain's ability to have these different thoughts and these different questions that it allows us to have an understanding about what God is there for and how God interacts with us.
All of these hundreds of studies that have been done on the efficacy of prayer, and some double-blind studies, some where they're praying for bacteria, it grows faster, or skin wounds, and people don't know who's being prayed for, who doesn't, those wounds heal faster. How do you understand that in terms of this big picture? Because it's not just that our experience of God placates us, it's that there seems to be another force at work that we can start to work with and through.
Right.
How do you understand that? Being a scientist, are you religious yourself, and how do you bridge that?
So, well, let me...
Two questions.
There's a couple of questions there. First of all, with regards to the actual effects of spirituality on us as human beings, there's sort of a direct effect that when somebody actually prays within themselves or does meditation, that people have found beneficial effects. People have looked at individuals who are more religious or who take part in more spiritual practices than others, and have generally found them to have lower levels of blood pressure, lower rates of dying, less disease, and usually better psychological health. They usually have higher levels of self-esteem, less depression, better happiness, better interpersonal relationships. Of course, that's not absolutely universal, but that's the trend that we see. Now, to a large extent, our research helps to form a link between what we see on this sort of clinical level and how we understand what's going on physiologically, because we're looking at the different parts of the brain that are involved. We know, for example, that some of the areas in the brain involved in emotional processing we think are involved in meditation. So if people are sort of tweaking those areas when they meditate, then we could start to explain why they may have lower levels of depression or more happiness. And we also can see through our models that their brain is ultimately connected to the body and helps to regulate things like blood pressure and heart rate. So a lot of people have shown, for example, that by meditating or doing prayer that you lower your blood pressure. And our studies sort of reflect why that may be the case in terms of the different parts of the brain that regulate blood pressure and heart rate are affected during the practice, so that we can understand that change. And then, of course, that is what ultimately may translate into some of the global effects, because people who, for example, lower blood pressure that's a major risk factor for heart disease and stroke. So if you can control that a little bit better, then you're going to improve your chances in terms of your health-related issues when you're looking at things from a global perspective. So that's sort of a direct mechanism of
that's
how...
for the prayer. I'm talking about the
right, exactly,
prayer.
and that's the second mecanism, which is certainly more difficult to explain from a sort of traditional science
point of view.
Right, exactly. And I usually have a couple of answers. I mean, one, certainly it's very intriguing research, and we need to learn more about it. I don't know. I would definitely say that these things are certainly happening, but I certainly wouldn't be able to rule them out at this point. But what we can say is that if those things are happening, then there is a mechanism by which it happens. I mean, it's not magic.
You're not really to throw out your cause and effect hypothesis just because you don't see the connection between the cause here and the effect
I think the connection is just something that we haven't been able to...
Yet.
I mean, if it does exist, then it's something that we haven't been able to observe yet. But by understanding what happens in the brain of people, we might ultimately be able to look at that and see how that actually happens.
What if it's like a dolphin who can, when he wants to emit sonar, actually changes the shape of that instrument that he's got inside his brain, and it directs the sonar. It's emitted,
right,
and then it bounces back, and you gain information. So you can actually interact through these brain waves, thought waves, whatever.
Sure.
Who knows that we're not already doing that in some capacity
Sure.
that
I mean,
we're
there's
not aware
of.
So, but it's interesting that you can project and have an influence at a distance.
Right. I mean, and on very basic levels, we do see this. I mean, when we speak to somebody, we have an effect. Or we say, you do this, and then they interact.
The conduit.
And we see the conduit. So like I said, one of the things in terms of this particular question is that we may just not have had the opportunity to actually observe how this mechanism actually works. And I think as we are able to study it, and as with all of science, the more we're able to understand things, usually the better we are at trying to figure out exactly what's going on, and we will either try to confirm them in some way, or we might be able to find that it either is true or it isn't true that these things can happen, and if it is true, that we'll ultimately find ways in which it can happen. Science is always coming up with new and often counterintuitive ways of understanding the world. And you look at quantum mechanics and some of the cosmological models about the origin of the universe. They don't make any sense from a very sort of intuitive perspective, but they do make sense in terms of how the universe actually works. So it's very likely that if there are these kinds of abilities to interact with things at a distance, then we'll just have to sort of explore and understand them a little bit better. I think our research may actually ultimately help in that regard, because we do understand what's happening in the person's brain or body that may have that kind of effect. We haven't personally been studying that at this point, but because I think we have enough work to do just with trying to understand what's happening within ourselves.
But at the same time, they say that when you do research, you take, cancer research, take a cell, put it in a petri dish, it's going to behave somewhat differently isolated in that petri dish than it does in the whole context of the human body.
That's right.
And so how can we really take a snapshot of a brain and see it in isolation when there might be a lot going on of communication through some other processes we're not yet aware of to the universe at large, to our environment immediately, or whatever.
Well, I mean, we all,
just putting it out there.
we always...
but we have to do what we can do with what we have to work with at the present time.
We have to do what we can do. And also, even when you have abilities to measure lots of different things, our brain is set up, our science is set up in such a way that we often do have to really look at actual things. The larger type of thing that you're looking at, the more variables and stuff get entered into. So while you're absolutely right, you have to always keep those things in mind. it also is sometimes helpful to look at some of the individual characteristics. It goes back to the issue about like looking at people who have temporal lobe seizures. I think that provides information, and that's helpful for us to understand how these experiences may occur in a person.
For the complete answer.
But it's not the whole thing, yeah.
Yeah. Some personal questions, if you don't mind. Are you religious?
Well, actually, it is a good question, and I've actually found that how I answer that is also kind of a complex problem, because a lot of times people enter into this field of science, and if they're very religious, they may be accused of trying to prove their religion through science. And conversely, if they're not religious, then people are saying, oh, you're just trying to bash religion. I think we tend to walk, and myself and some of my colleagues tend to walk a line that's sort of in between. I don't practice a particular religious tradition in a formal way at this point, but a lot of my own approaches to understanding things, part of why I'm doing the science and part of how I'm doing my own sort of searching of these types of questions, has certainly led me down different paths which are contemplative in their nature, and in many ways I would define them as spiritual. But I think we ultimately do need to find a way of sort of putting all of these different aspects of who we are and all of the different techniques that we have that to bring them to bear to help us understand and answer some of these really big questions about reality and our place in the universe. So to me, it's always sort of an ongoing process, an ongoing journey, and the more information we can bring to it, the better off we all are.
Do you have a spiritual technique such as meditation? I mean, you're looking at the various benefits, or prayer, you're looking at various benefits to one's physiology with practicing these methods. You know, many of these benefits would be, if the drug companies could package it into a pill, would be a best-selling drug.
Right.
Take this, get these benefits. But sit down, meditate, get these benefits. Say a prayer, get these benefits.
Right.
So it seems to me when you're looking at this so directly, how can you but not want to gain these benefits for yourself?
Right.
So my question is, do you have a particular spiritual technique? Are you experimenting?
Again, I think my own technique is really more my own search for these kinds of answers to questions. And you actually raise an interesting issue, which has actually had some certain religious people a little concerned about the whole relationship between science and spirituality, and I sometimes even been surprised, but they don't want to feel that people are doing religion or spirituality in order to achieve health benefits.
Just the health process.
Exactly. That's not the reason for it. They are there for spiritual purposes and to derive meaning and the answers to important questions in our lives. And that's why I have sort of gone down my own journey, my own sort of scientific and contemplative path to try to find the answers to these questions. So I don't particularly practice anything, at least for a health benefit per se, but the things that I have been doing for my own self have just been kind of my own approach to these questions, and to just sort of keep pursuing them. I think to a large extent how we understand and how we define spirituality does have to do with that search for what we consider to be sacred. In fact, I had the privilege of being part of this large consensus conference of about 80 different health scientists who were coming together to talk about the issue of spirituality and mental and health, both mental and physical. And a large percentage of the conference was spent trying to define it, and one of the definitions they had for spirituality was a search for the sacred, and with the idea that both the term search and the term sacred were very broadly defined. So to a large extent, I think that there's a certain relevance to that in all of our lives, which is that we're always trying to sort of strive for meaning. We're always searching for that interconnectedness with other things and ultimately with whatever we define as our fundamental reality, whether that is just a fundamental reality or whether we define it as the universe or whether we define it as God.
Basically, we believe in God because we just can't help ourselves. We are meant to do this. I find that just so fascinating. And I would also say to those religious leaders who are fearful of people picking up a practice because for the benefits rather than for the whole spiritual bent, I think spirituality would come that if you were doing a particular meditation, sure, you're going to gain the physiological benefits, but I think it also habituates your mind to have that experience of unity and oneness with our Creator, and to have that kind of elevated mental experience that becomes soon an elevated spiritual experience, I think the one naturally bleeds into the other. It's like the three legs of the stool. You pull one leg, the other two come along.
No, that's very true. I mean, and to a
I wouldn't worry
certain
about
extent,
it.
right? No, I mean, I think
whatever brings people in.
That we need to be open to all the different approaches. But you also made me think of something which is kind of an interesting side issue here, which is that we've spent a lot of this time talking about all the wonderful things that spirituality and religion do for us, and that is true. I mean, a lot of studies have looked at that, but there's also the negative side to this. And when we look at a biological relationship between spirituality and ourselves, we can see that there are certain times when spirituality may have a negative consequence. A lot of studies, for example, a lot of studies have looked at people who are substance abusers, either alcohol or different drugs, and frequently they will have a very punitive view of God, that they feel that God is punishing them, and it can actually have a very detrimental effect on how they are as people and how they feel about themselves.
Do you suppose that they fall into addictions to substances because they are seeking an experience of transcendence and they're using drugs in a negative way instead of a spiritual experience in a positive way? It's the same mechanism just being abused in their brain?
Some people have suggested that, and some research has supported that. I think that it's a hard question to answer. These drug addiction issues are very complicated, and they probably have a number of different factors that are involved, but that's certainly very likely to be one of them. And I think as we learn more about addictions and different types of problems like that, we may ultimately find a little bit more answers along those lines as to how spirituality does come in as a role in terms of whether that has sent them to this to try to find answers in some other way that they weren't able to normally attain through their own spirituality, for example. There's also another very interesting issue, which is that when people have very powerful spiritual experiences, how they ultimately incorporate them into their lives. While a lot of people who have had near-death experiences, and you mentioned that earlier in the program, certainly have very positive feelings about it. It changes their lives. It reduces their fear of death and so forth.
That's not true across the board.
It is not true across the board, and it's actually interesting that even though, and that has nothing to do with the idea that even though, I mean, some of them are actually negative kinds of experiences, but even when people have a very positive experience, if somebody, let's say, has been a practicing Catholic all their lives, and then when they're 45 years old, they have a near-death experience, if that near-death experience has no relationship whatsoever to the types of religious beliefs and practices that they've been pursuing their entire life, that creates a great crisis for them in terms of their ability to understand this very powerfully real experience and how it ultimately relates into their lives, because they now have to solve some fundamental paradox and try to find a way of incorporating it. People who can incorporate it easily do very well, but people sometimes can't, and that can be it can have a very negative impact on them. Sometimes they're afraid to talk about those experiences. Sometimes it creates a great deal of anxiety for them.
I would see life's challenges as part of the spiritual quest, though. This is just what's put in front of us in order to grow and to be challenged and to find solutions outside of ourselves and to transcend ultimately. Rather than being rolled over by the boulder in front of you, you've got to learn to jump over it and transcend it.
That's true, but it is. But sometimes it doesn't mean that you don't have to go through that difficult process.
Yep. So, Andrew, thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing and to coming to our studio and sharing it with us. It certainly opens up some real intriguing questions. And are you glad to know that we are hardwired, so to speak, for religious experiences, for mystical experiences? Does that comfort you in a sense? It does me.
I think it's helpful in terms of our understanding of our place in the world and our place in the universe and how we make sense of all the different issues and questions that we face all the time. Those big questions that we've been striving to answer for many, many thousands of years. So I think it is helpful to know about the biological basis of these experiences and feelings, and to hope to find some way of integrating this spiritual aspect, the spiritual perspective of our lives with the biological ones.
You know, also when you look at many of the wars that have been conducted through history in the name of God, my God's the only right God, your God's the wrong God, and all of that, you can see another negative aspect to this whole attachment to religion. Mm-hmm. So one hopes that as humanity grows and develops, we learn to be religiously diverse. You find in the ecosystem diversity is a plus, and I find that true for the human tapestry.
Right.
That let's celebrate our diversity. We're all here plugged into God at some aspect. So
Sure.
let's
And
respect
of course we all
the
have
multifaceted nature of it.
Right. We all have brains that function in similar ways, so that does explain why there is such a universal quality of religious experiences across cultures and so forth. But of course everybody brings to them their own individual differences and the different places that they are, their environments and their individual cultural beliefs. But it is fascinating to see some of the similarities that exist across cultures as well, and that's part of where we look in some of our research, not just at the differences, but at the similarities.
But what we have in common
Exactly.
and why.
Right.
Thanks so much. That was
Thank
Andrew
you.
Newberg. His book is Why God Won't Go Away, Brain Science and the Biology of Belief.